Gentlemen,
All right.
it's great to have you here. Let's try to have a nuanced discussion / debate and maybe even steel man opposing perspectives as much as possible. All right. As it stands now, there's a barely stable ceasefire between Iran and Israel. Let's maybe rewind a little bit. Can we first lay out the context for this Iran-Israel war and try to describe the key events that happened over the past 2 weeks? Maybe even a bit of the deep roots of the conflict.
Sure, Lex. First of all, thanks so much for having me on. Great to be on with Scott. I know he and I don't agree on a lot, but I certainly admire the passion and the dedication to stopping wars. So that's something we want to talk about. So let's talk about how we got to this war. So President Trump comes into office and immediately lays out that his Iran strategy is maximum pressure on the regime, and he will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And he makes that clear consistently. I think made it very clear during his first term, made it clear throughout his career. And thus begins this process with the Iranians, which has kind of multiple tracks, but the one that Trump sees most interested in at the time is the diplomatic track. And he makes it very clear from the beginning in a sort of Oval Office remark. He says the Iranians can either blow up their nuclear program under US supervision or someone's going to blow it up for them. And even though, at the time we think Netanyahu is really trying to push the president into a military campaign, well, I'm sure we'll talk about that throughout the podcast. The president authorizes his lead negotiator and close friend, Steve Witkoff, to begin outreach to the Iranians. And thus begun the Oman round. And it's Oman round because it's taking place in Oman with mediation efforts by the Omanis. There are 5 rounds of negotiations with the Iranians. And through the course of those negotiations, the U.S. finally puts on the table an offer for Iran. We'll talk about the details of that. The Iranians reject that offer. And we're now into the 6th round, which is supposed to take place on a Sunday. On the Thursday before the Sunday, the Israelis strike. And they go after, in a rather devastating campaign over a matter of now 12 days, they go over and go after Iran's nuclear program, the key nuclear sites, going after weapons scientists who are responsible for building Iran's nuclear weapons program, and also go after top IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard commanders, as well as top military commanders. And yet there's still this one site that is the most fortified site. It's called Fordo. It's an enrichment facility. It's buried under a mountain, goes about 80 meters deep. It's encased in concrete. It has advanced centrifuges and highly enriched uranium. The Israelis can do damage to it, but it's clear it's going to take the United States and our military power in order to severely degrade this facility. And Trump orders the United States Air Force to fly B-2 bombers and drop 12 massive ordnance penetrators, which are these 30,000-pound bombs, on Fordo in order to, as he said, obliterate it, more realistically, to severely degrade it. So that happens. And then he offers the Iranians, as he's been offering all the way through, you have an option. You can go back to Oman. I told you Oman, and you decided to force me to go to Fordo. But now we can go back for negotiations. And he forces a ceasefire on the Iranians, gets the Israelis to agree. And that's where we are today. Lex, we're at as you say, a tentative ceasefire that just came into effect. And we'll see now if the Iranians decide to take President Trump on his repeated offers, join him in Oman for another round of negotiations.
Scott, is there some stuff you want to add to that?
Sure. Well, he started with January, right? Trump's second term here and the maximum pressure campaign. Essentially, as should be clear to everyone now, all these negotiations were just a pretext for war. Trump and his entire cabinet must have known that the Ayatollah is not going to give up all enrichment. That is their latent nuclear deterrent. Their posture has been heavily implied, don't attack us and we won't make a nuke. While America's position was, if you make a nuke, if you start to, we'll attack you. So it was the perfect standoff. But what happened was, and you might remember a few weeks ago, there was some talk about, well, maybe we could find a way to compromise on some enrichment. Maybe they could do a consortium with the Saudis. Maybe there's some way that and then nope, the pressure came down. No enrichment, zero enrichment. But that's a red line. Everyone knows that there's And even now, it's probably less likely than ever that they're going to give up enrichment. Sure, they bombed Fordo, but they didn't destroy every last centrifuge in that place. And the Iranians are already announcing that they're already begun construction on another facility under a taller mountain, buried even deeper. And, they figured out how to enrich uranium hexafluoride gas, 20 years ago now. And they will always be able to. And this is the slippery slope that we're on with these wars. In fact, I saw our friend here on TV the other day, as he almost pretty much just implied there, saying, well, now Trump has to go in. We were told it's just Israel doing it, don't worry. But then, no, Trump has to hit Fordo, or else now they'll break out toward a nuclear weapon. So in for a penny, in for a pound, in for a ton. And now, once we bomb Fordo again and Natanz again and the new facility again, then it'll be decided that, nope, as Benjamin Netanyahu said the other day, it would really solve this problem if we just kill the Ayatollah. Then everything will be fine. Then we'll have a regime change. And then what? Then we'll have a civil war with bin Ladenites again in the catbird seat, just like George Bush put them in Iraq and Barack Obama put them in Libya and in Syria. And we'll have Aziris and Baluchi suicide bombers and Shiite, revolutionaries and whoever all vying for power in the new absolute chaos stand. If you listen to the administration and Mr. Dubowitz, they're essentially just implying that, like, oh yeah, mission accomplished. We did it. Their nuclear program's destroyed. Now we don't have to worry about that anymore. But that's not true. Now there's every reason to believe, and we don't know for sure, there's every reason to believe that at least is much more likely now that the Ayatollah will change his mind about God changing his mind and will say that actually maybe we do need a nuclear deterrent. That's really what it's been for this whole time, is a bluff. We have bullets in one pocket, revolver in another. Let's not you and me fight and escalate this thing. It's the same position, by the way, as Japan and Germany and Brazil. 2 of the 3 of those are under America's nuclear umbrella, I admit, but still, where they've proven they've mastered the fuel cycle and they can make nuclear weapons. But hey, since nobody's directly threatening them now, why escalate things and go ahead and make atom bombs? That has been their position the whole time, because after all, they could not break out and make a nuke without everyone in the world knowing about it. And that's why, Lex, and I'm sure you could vouch for me on this, if you've been watching TV over the past few weeks, you'll hear Marco Rubio and all the government officials and all the war hawks say, oh yeah, 60%, 60%. What do you think they need with that 60%? Implying that, oh yeah, see, they're racing toward a bomb. But you see how they always just imply that? They won't come right out and say that because it's a ridiculous lie. They could have enriched up to 90+% uranium-235 this whole time. The reason they were enriching up to 60% was in reaction to Israeli sabotage. First of all, assassinating their nuclear scientists, and then their sabotage at Natanz. They started enriching up to 60%, just like they did in the Obama years, to have a bargaining chip to negotiate away. Under the JCPOA, they shipped out every bit of their enriched uranium to France to be turned into fuel rods and then shipped back into the country to be used in their reactors. And so they're just trying to get us back in that deal. It is an illusion. It is, and I don't know exactly what's in this man's mind, but it's just not true that they're making nuclear weapons. And it has been a lie of Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party regime, and for that matter, the Kadima regime of Ehud Olmert before him, that this is a threat that has to be preempted, when in fact, it never was anything more than a latent nuclear deterrent.
Maybe a good question to ask here is, what is the goal for the United States and Iran in relation to the Iran's nuclear program? What is the red line here? Does Iran have this need for a latent nuclear deterrent? And what is the thing that's acceptable to the United States and to the rest of the world? What should be acceptable?
Yeah, Lex. So there was a lot to unpack there. So let's sort of just back up a little bit and let's talk about, first of all, the regime itself. Islamic Republic of Iran came into power in 1979. It has been declared a leading state sponsor of terrorism by multiple administrations, dating back to the Clinton administration, by Obama, by Biden, by Trump. And it is a regime that has killed and maimed thousands of Americans, not to mention, obviously, hundreds of thousands of Middle Easterners. It is a regime that has lied about its nuclear program. It never actually disclosed its nuclear sites. All these sites were discovered by Iranian opposition groups, by Western intelligence agencies, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the UN agency responsible for preventing proliferation has come out again and again over many, many years in reports, very detailed reports, describing Iran's nuclear weapons program. There have been multiple attempts at diplomacy with Iran. I'm sure we're going to talk about it. Scott mentioned the JCPOA, so we should certainly talk about the JCPOA, which was the 2015 deal that Barack Obama reached with Iran. But multiple attempts to actually get the Iranians to negotiate away their nuclear weapons program. I mean, it's worth mentioning that if Iran wanted to have civilian nuclear energy, there are 23 countries in the world that have it, but they don't have enrichment and they don't have reprocessing. We sign these deals called the gold standard with the South Koreans, with the Emiratis, with others. And we say, if you want civilian energy, you can have power plants, you can buy your fuel rods from abroad, but there's no reason to have enrichment or plutonium reprocessing because those are the key capabilities you need to develop nuclear weapons. Now, the 5 countries that have those capabilities and don't have nuclear weapons are Argentina, Brazil, Holland, Germany, and Japan. And I think it's the view of many administrations over many years, including many European leaders, that the Islamic Republic of Iran is very different from those aforementioned countries because that it has been dedicated to terrorism. It's been killing Americans and other Westerners and other Middle Easterners, and it is a dangerous regime. You don't want to have that dangerous regime retaining the key capabilities and needs to develop nuclear weapons. But I want to kind of get back more to the present. I mentioned this was around the negotiations at Oman. Scott's saying that President Trump had said, here's the offer, take it or leave it, zero enrichment, full dismantlement. Well, in fact, that wasn't the offer that was presented to the Iranians at Oman. The offer was a one-page offer, and it said you can temporarily enrich above ground. You've got to render your below ground facilities, quote, non-operational. And then at some time in the future, 3-4 years, as Scott said, there'll be a consortium that'll be built, not on Iranian territory. It'll be a partnership with the Saudis and the Emiratis. It'll be under IAEA supervision. And that enrichment facility will create fuel rods for your nuclear reactors. So that was the offer presented to Iran. And that offer would come with significant sanctions relief, billions of dollars that would go to the regime. Obviously, the economy there has been suffering. The regime has not had the resources that it's had in the past to fund its what I call its axis of misery, its proxy terror armies around the world. And it was a good offer. And I was shocked that Khamenei rejected it. He did reject it. And I think he rejected it because I think he believed that he could continue to do to President Trump what he had done to President Obama, which is just continue to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze the Americans at the table in order to ensure that he could keep all these nuclear facilities, all these nuclear capabilities, so that at a time of his choosing, when President Trump is gone, he can develop nuclear weapons. Now, it is a bit interesting to say that Iran has no intention to develop nuclear weapons. And let's examine the nuclear program and ask, does this sound like a regime that's not interested in building nuclear weapons? So they built deeply buried underground enrichment facilities that they hid from the international community and they didn't disclose. Okay? They had an active nuclear warhead program called the MAD, which ended in 2003 formally when the United States invaded Iraq. And we know that because not only has that been detailed by the IAEA, but actually Mossad, in a daring operation in Tehran, took out a nuclear archive and brought it back to the West. And then the IAEA, the United States, and the intelligence communities went after this detailed archive, went into it, and discovered that this supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, had an active program to build 5 atomic warheads. And was a very detailed program with blueprints and designs, all of which was designed under Ahmad to build a nuclear weapons program. So again, it's interesting to say that he doesn't have the intention to build nuclear weapons when he actually had an active nuclear weapons program. And we can talk about what happened to that program after 2003, and there's a lot of interesting details. So when you combine the fact that he has an active nuclear weapons program, he has sites that are buried deep underground, he has weapons scientists who come out of the Ahmad program and continue to work on the initial metallurgy work and computer modeling designed to actually begin that process of building a warhead. And all of this has been hidden from the international community. He has spent estimates of $500 billion on his nuclear program, in direct costs and in sanctions costs. And one has to ask, and I think it's an interesting question, to compare the UAE and Iran. Right? The UAE signed the gold standard. They said we'll have no enrichment capability or reprocessing. They spent about $20 billion on that, and it supplies 25% of their electrical generation. Khamenei spent $500 billion, and that program supplies maybe 3% of their electrical needs. In fact, they have a reactor that they bought from the Russians called Bushehr. And that reactor, it's exactly what you'd want in a proliferation-proof reactor. They buy fuel rods from the Russians, they use it, and they send the spent fuel back to Russia so it cannot be reprocessed into plutonium. So I just think it's important for your listeners to understand just some of the technical nuclear history here in order to unpack this question of, did Khamenei want nuclear weapons? What was his goal here? And then we can talk about, was this the right operation in order for the United States to order the B-2 bombers to strike these facilities in what, again, was a limited operation, as President Trump has said, and in order to drive the Iranians back to the negotiating table and finally do the deal that President Trump has asked them to do since he came into office in January.
Yeah, that is one of the fascinating questions, whether this Operation Midnight Hammer increased or decreased the chance that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon.
Right. Before you ask any more questions, I have to refute virtually everything he just said, which is completely false.
I mean, really everything? There was not one thing I said that was true? Just one thing.
I mean, Iran is a nation over there somewhere. You got that part right.
All right. 22 years of working on Iran, and I got that right.
So,
but do you know the population of Iran?
92 million.
Okay.
So, first of all, they were trying to buy a light water reactor from the Europeans or the Chinese in the 1990s, and Bill Clinton wouldn't let them, and it put tremendous pressure on China to prevent them from selling them a light water reactor, a turnkey reactor that produces waste that's so polluted with impurities that you can't make nuclear weapons fuel out of it. By the way, they never have to this day had a reprocessing facility for reprocessing plutonium, even their current plutonium waste from their heavy water reactor at Bushehr, to make weapons fuel out of that. They have no plutonium route to the bomb under the JCPOA.
But they have that at Iraq, not Bushehr. There's a difference between Iraq. Iraq is where
they pour concrete into the reactor and shut it down.
And the reason they poured concrete
under the JCPOA,
not they, but the Obama administration, he's right, under the JCPOA, poured concrete into the Calindria in order to prevent them from using that reactor to reprocess plutonium. So there's a distinction between Iraq and Bushehr. Scott's exactly right. Bushehr is a reactor, a heavy water reactor provided by the Russians, as I described, for the generation of electricity. It's proliferation proof. Iraq is the opposite. It's a heavy water reactor that was built for a plutonium pathway to nuclear weapons, which is exactly why under the JCPOA, they literally had to pour concrete into the middle of it to prevent it from reprocessing plutonium.
I think we're going to need a scientist to come in here and split the difference, or maybe we need to go and look up some IAEA documents, because I don't believe that Iraq ever had a reprocessing facility for their plutonium waste. And the deal under the JCPOA, the Russians would come and get all their plutonium waste, which the waste comes out all polluted and not useful. You need the reprocessing facility to get all of the impurities
just to
out.
Clarify,
it really could be that I'm wrong about that, but I don't believe that they ever had a reprocessing facility at Iraq that they could use to remove all those impurities and then have weapons-grade plutonium fuel as the North Koreans do.
So the Obama administration was very clear under the JCPOA, we are going to pour concrete into the Iraq facility, as Scott acknowledged, because we are concerned that Iraq can be used for reprocessing plutonium for a plutonium pathway to a nuclear weapon.
Can be used, but we don't know if it was used.
Oh, we know it never was. There never was any reprocessing of weapons fuel there.
But there was concrete poured.
I'm happy to.
There's no indication.
For your viewers who are interested, and not to plug my own podcast, Lex, I apologize. But
it is a very good podcast.
I just recently had David Albright on my podcast, who is actually a physicist and a weapons inspector, and goes into a lot of detail about the Iranian nuclear program. Please listen to the podcast.
Iran Breakdown, by the way, is the name of the podcast.
Yeah, and David's the president of the Institute for Science and International Security. By the way, spent decades on this. And to his credit, he was one of the deep skeptics of the Bush administration's rush to war with Iraq. And
that's not true. He vouched for claims that there were chemical weapons in Iraq and later said he was sorry for it.
Again, I mentioned the Bush administration's rush to war based on their claims that Saddam was building nuclear weapons.
He did debunk the aluminum tubes, though.
He debunked it, and was a deep skeptic again of the rush to war in Iraq. The argument today, Lex, which I think is the more interesting argument, because there are very few people left today who don't believe that the Iranians were building the nuclear weapons capability that gave them the option to build nuclear weapons.
I already said that.
We can debate whether they had decided to, and I'm interested to hear Scott's opinion on this, but the recent intelligence that has come out that the Iranian nuclear weapons scientists have begun preliminary work on building a warhead.
Came out from where? This intelligence that came out. Who put that into Israeli claims? Not verified by the US and the Wall Street Journal anywhere, right?
Let's talk
about all of my list of refutations of all your false claims from 10 years ago.
The Wall Street Journal did verify
this.
There's
a lot of
Lawrence Norman
to refute.
One at a time.
Lawrence Norman actually wrote a piece.
Yeah.
This was during the Biden administration, because the Biden DNI had actually come out and for the first time in their annual threat assessment had removed a line that said Iran is not currently working on developing any capabilities that would put it in a position to actually deliver a nuclear warhead. And what became the Lawrence Norman piece in the Wall Street Journal was that there actually was initial work done on metallurgy and on computer modeling. And so those actually were defined terms in Section T of the 2015 JCPOA, which defined weaponization in that section. And metallurgy and computer modeling were some of the initial steps. So that the DNI was very concerned under Biden that these initial steps meant that either Khamenei had given the green light, or nuclear weapons scientists, in order to get ahead of the boss so they could be in a position, if he decided to move forward on this, were in a position and their timelines were therefore expedited. So it's interesting. I mean, again, you've got the DNI under Biden, you've got the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, you've got Israeli intelligence, you've got the Wall Street Journal, and you've got the IAEA asking questions of Iran on its past weaponization activities. Why are you denying us?
Who's the dog that didn't bark there? The current director of national intelligence, who issued her threat assessment, Trump's director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who issued her threat assessment in February that repeated the exact same language that from the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007, and that the CIA and the NIE, the National Intelligence Council, have reaffirmed repeatedly ever since then, which is that Supreme Leader has not decided to pursue nuclear weapons. He has not made the political decision to pursue nuclear weapons. She testified, in fact, under oath in front of the Senate in March. And then, according to CNN and the New York Times, there was a brand new assessment that was put together the week before the attack was launched, reaffirming the same thing. And at least in history, if you read it in Haaretz, Mossad agreed with the CIA.
I'd like to just sort of quote CIA Director John Ratcliffe, because Scott brought up the CIA and the intelligence community. I think Ratcliffe had a good way of looking at this, and that he said is, when you're in the 99-yard line as a football team, you have the intention to score a goal, quote unquote. And what he was actually pointing to is, let's not talk about this debate about whether Khamenei had given the order or not given the order, because Khamenei knows that if he gives an order, the U.S. and Israeli intelligence community will pick up on that order, and that will be the trigger for strikes. What Ratcliffe is saying is that Khamenei had built the nuclear weapons capability. He's at the 99-yard line, and both the CIA and European leaders, the European intelligence community has said for years that if Iran has that capability and they're on the 99-yard line, at that point it's going to be too late to stop them. Once that decision is made to assemble the final warhead, which, by the way, is the final piece of what you need for a deliverable nuclear weapon.
So that's not true at all, right? They have to resort to a crude analogy about football yard lines because they can't say the truth, which is that they had zero weapons-grade uranium. They were not producing it. They were trying to get the United States back in the deal that they are still officially within, the JCPOA with the rest of the UN Security Council, wherein they shipped all of their enriched uranium stockpile out of the country to France to be transferred to fuel rods. Their insistence was on their continued ability to enrich uranium. And so this goes to one of the things that he at least sort of brought up that deserves addressing. When Trump came into power in 2017, he decided on this Israeli-influenced maximum pressure campaign, and he said the JCPOA was the worst deal in the history of any time any two men ever shook hands, and all these kinds of things in his hyperbolic way, which of course made it very difficult for him to figure out a way to stay in the thing or to compromise along its lines. But the fact of the matter is, if he had just played it straight and said, listen, Ayatollah, we don't have to be friends, but we do have a deal here, which my predecessors struck with you, but I don't like these sunset provisions. And I want to send my guys over there and see if we can figure out a way to convince you that we really wish you'd shut down calm altogether, or this or that or the other thing, and try to approach them in good faith. We talk about yard lines and things. We had a JCPOA. Okay. So toward peace, we were past the 50-yard line. Donald Trump could have gone to Tehran and shook hands with the Ayatollah, as Dick Cheney complained that we had cold relations with Iran back in 1998 when he was the head of Halliburton. And so we can do business with these guys. Donald Trump could have gone right over there and done business. And instead, he gave in to Netanyahu's lies in this ridiculous hoax that they had uncovered all these Iranian nuclear documents, which he pretends is legit, where all they did was recycle the fake Israeli-forged smoking laptop of 2005, which they lied and pretended was the laptop of an Iranian scientist that was smuggled out of Iran by his wife and had all this proof of a secret Iranian nuclear weapons program on it. But every bit of that was refuted, including the thing about the warhead, he said, was refuted by David Albright and his friend David Sanger in the New York Times, that all those sketches of the warhead for the missile were wrong, because when Mossad forged the documents, they were making a good, educated guess, but they didn't know that Iran had completely redesigned the nose cone of their mid-range missiles and had an entirely different nose cone that would require an entirely different warhead than that described in the documents. And why would they have been designing a warhead to fit in a nose cone that they were abandoning? And so that was refuted. David Albright completely discredited your claims there, pal. And then they later admitted that it was a CIA laptop. There was no laptop. And they later admitted, Ali Heinonen admitted, who was a very hawkish, one of the, not director, but a high-level executive at the International Atomic Energy Agency, admitted that that intelligence was brought into the stream by the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, communist terrorist cult, that used to work for the Ayatollah during the revolution, then turned on him, and he turned on them and kicked them out. Then they went to work for Saddam Hussein, where they helped crush the Shiite and Kurdish insurrection of 1991. And then they became America, Donald Rumsfeld's and Ariel Sharon's sock puppets, and later Ehud Olmert's sock puppets, when the United States invaded Iraq and took possession of them. They're now under American protection in Albania. And these are the same kooks who just a few weeks ago, you might remember, said, look, new satellite pictures of a whole new nuclear facility in Iran. Isn't it funny how no one ever brought that up again? Didn't bomb it. It was nothing. It was fake. Just like before when they said, hey, look, here's a picture of a vault door, and behind that is where the secret nuclear weapons program is. Except it turned out that vault door was a stock photo from a vault company. It meant nothing. And they had repeatedly, made claims that were totally refuted. Just like I'm about to refute his claim that they ever were the ones who revealed, for example, Natanz. He was implying that Natanz and Qom were both buried and hidden until revealed, I think you said, by dissident groups, that is, the MEK, sock puppets of the Israelis. But it was your friend David Albright, not the Israeli Mossad through the MEK, who revealed Natanz facility. Ask him, he'll fistfight you over it. He claims credit. He was first and said, this is a facility. However, they were not in violation of their safeguards agreement with the IAEA. They were still 6 months away from introducing any nuclear material to that facility. And so when it was revealed, they weren't in violation of anything. And then on Qom, we had a huge fight about this at the time. The party line came down from all the government officials and the media that they had just exposed the facility there. Qom is Fordo, same thing. When in fact that wasn't true. The Iranians had announced to the IAEA that we have built a new facility here and we are going to introduce nuclear material into it within 6 months. So here's your official notification. And then a few days later, they just pretended to expose it, when it was the Iranians themselves who had admitted to it in going along with their obligations under their safeguards agreement. So it's just completely wrong. Why do they bury them? They buried them for protection because clearly the Israelis have indicated since the 1990s that they consider any nuclear program in Iran to be the same thing as an advanced nuclear weapons program. You're hearing that today. For them to have a nuclear facility at all is equivalent to them going ahead and breaking out and making a nuclear weapon. And so, of course, they know that they have to have it buried to protect it from Israel. That doesn't mean that they are trying to get nukes. It does mean, as I already said, that they wanted to prove to the world that they know how to enrich uranium and that they have facilities buried deeply enough where if we attack them, that would incentivize them to making nukes, and then we might be unable to stop them without going all the way toward a regime change, which they're bluffing, basically betting that we won't go that far, considering how gigantic their country is and how mountainous and populous it is compared to Iraq next door. Now, here's some more things that he said that weren't true. So he said Iran has been killing Americans all this time. Well, that's almost always a reference to Beirut 1983, which you can read in the book By Way of Deception by Viktor Ostrovsky, the former Mossad officer, that the Israelis knew that they were building that truck bomb to bomb the Marines with and withheld that information from the United States and said that's what they get for sticking their big noses in. And that is in the book By Way of Deception by Viktor Ostrovsky. And by the way, the Israelis were friends with them, with Iran at the time in all through the 1980s. And it was just a couple of years later when Ronald Reagan sold Iran missiles and using the Israelis as cutouts to do so when he switched sides temporarily in the Iran-Iraq war. And so that's just, and that was in 1983. If Ronald Reagan can sell them missiles a year or 2 years after that, 3 years after that, then surely the United States and the Ayatollah can bury the hatchet from that. And no one's ever even, I don't believe, ever really proven that Tehran ordered that. It was a Shiite militia backed by Iran, that sort of proto-Hezbollah, that did that attack, that killed those Marines. And if there's some responsibility for it, then damn them. Like if there's direct responsibility for that, not just their support for the group, then damn them for that. But that's still no reason in the world to say that we can't get along with them now, when that was in the same year Return of the Jedi came out, okay? And then the other one, and this is always referred to, you'll see this on TV news today. Anyone watching this, turn on TV news and you'll hear them say, Iran killed 600 Americans in Iraq War II. But that's a lie. There was a gigantic propaganda campaign by Dick Cheney and his co-conspirators, David Petraeus and Michael Gordon of the New York Times, now at the Wall Street Journal, where they lied and lied like the devil for about 5-6 months in early 2007, that every time a Shiite set off a roadside bomb, these new improved copper cord enhanced they're called EFPs, explosively formed penetrators. And that anytime that happened, Iran did it, which is what George Bush called shorthanding it. Yeah, in other words, just implying the lie. What they're saying is Iran backed Muqtada al-Sadr and America attacked Muqtada al-Sadr, who actually they were fighting the whole war for him. He remains a powerful kingmaker in that country this day. He was part of the United Iraqi Alliance. And in fact, as long as we're taking a long form here, he was the least Iran-tied of the 3 major factions in the United Iraqi Alliance in Iraq War II. The other 2 major factions were Dawa and the Supreme Islamic Council, and they had been living in Iran for the last 20 years. They're the ones who came and took over Baghdad. Muqtada al-Sadr was a Shiite and close to Iran, but he's also an Iraqi nationalist. And at times he allied with the Sunnis and tried to limit American and Iranian influence in the country, was more of an Arab and an Iraqi nationalist. And the Americans decided they hated him the most, not because he was the most Iran-tied, but because he was willing to tell us and them to get the hell out. And America was betting that if we backed the same parties that Iran backed in Iraq War II, that they would eventually end up needing our money and guns more than they would need their Iranian friends and co-religionists and sponsors next door, which of course did not work out. And America's had minimal influence in supermajority Shiite Iraq ever since the end of Iraq War II. And we can get back later in the show to how Israel helped lie us into that horrific war as well. But the fact of the matter is, it was not Iranians setting off those bombs, and it was not even Iranians making those bombs. And I show in my book enough already. I have a solid dozen sources.
Enough already.
Thank you. I have a solid dozen sources, including Michael Gordon's own colleague, Alyssa Rubin at the New York Times, and many others, where they found these bomb factories in Shiite Iraq. They were being made by Shiite Arab Iraqis. And when David Petraeus was going to have a big press conference and they laid out all the components, all the reporters gathered around and they started noticing that the components said made in UAE, made in Haditha, that is Iraq. In other words, there was no evidence whatsoever that these came from Iran. And then they called off the press conference, and Stephen Hadley, George Bush's second national security advisor, admitted that, yeah, we didn't have the evidence that we needed to present that. And I also quote one Marine and one high-level Army intelligence officer in there who were deeply involved in Iraq War, reconfirming that there was never any evidence that these bombs were coming across from Iran. Or especially that then even if they were, that was at the direction of the Quds Force or the Ayatollah. This was all just a propaganda campaign because Dick Cheney and David Petraeus were trying to give George Bush a reason to hit IRGC bases and start the war in 2007. And this sounds crazy, but there's like 4 major confirming sources for it. Dick Cheney's national security advisor, David Wormser, who was the author of the Clean Break Strategy, which we're going to talk about today. David Wormser in 2007 was saying, we want to work with the Israelis to start the war with Iran to force George Bush, to do an end run around George Bush and force him into the war. And that was reported originally by Stephen Clemens in the Washington Note, but it was later confirmed in the New York Times and by the Washington Post reporter Barton Gellman in his book Angler on Dick Cheney, that there was this huge, this was the end that they were going for, was they were trying so hard to force a war in 2007. And it was the commander of CENTCOM, Admiral Fallon, who said, over my dead body, we are not doing this. And then a few months later, the National Intelligence Council put out their NIE saying that there is no nuclear weapons program at all. And W. Bush complained in his memoir, Lex, that in his story, it's the Saudi king, His Royal Highness Abdullah, rather than Ehud Olmert. But he's saying, I'm sorry, Your Highness, Majesty, I can't attack Iran's nuclear program because my own intelligence agency says they don't have a military program. So how am I supposed to start a war with them when my own intelligence agencies say that? This is what Donald Trump just did, started anyway. Had his man Rubio say, well, screw the intelligence. I don't care what it says. We can just do this if we want to.
So first, let me say, on the cover of Enough Already, devastating, Daniel Ellsberg, outstanding, Daniel L. Davis, essential, Ron Paul. You are respected by a very large number of people. You have decades of experience in this. Same thing with Mark, extremely respected by a very large number of people, experts. There's a lot of disagreements here, and we're going to unfortunately leave a lot of the disagreements on the table for the aforementioned nuclear scientists to deconstruct later. So let's not like try to, every single claim does not have to be perfectly refuted. Let's just leave it on the table, the statements as they stand. And let's try to also find things we kind of agree on and try, I know this might be difficult, but to steel man the other side. That's the thing I would love to ask you, maybe give Mark a chance to speak a little bit, but to try to, for both of you, to try to steel man the other side. So people who are concerned about Iran developing a nuclear program, can you steel man that case? And the same, the people
I think
who
I
are
did
concerned.
in my opening statement, quite frankly. I don't carry any brief for the Ayatollah. I'm a Texan. I don't give a damn about what some Shiite theocrat says about nothing, right? My interest is the people of this country and its future and what's true. And so I don't mind telling you, even though the Iranians never said we're building a latent nuclear weapons capability. That's clearly what they're doing, is showing that they can make a nuke, so don't make me make a nuke. That has been their position. Their position has not been, I'm making a nuke so I can wipe Israel off the map. Their position has been, look, if you guys don't attack us, we could just keep this civilian program the way it is. And again, there's always the implication that they're just building up this uranium stockpile, but no, they're not. That was in reaction to 1, Donald Trump leaving the deal in 2018, 2, the assassination in December of 2020 of the Iranian nuclear scientist Farkhzada, or however you say that, and then in April of 21, the sabotage at Natanz. And there's a Reuters story that says, right after they sabotaged Natanz, that's when the Ayatollah decided, let's enrich up to 60%, which, why stop 30% short of 90%? 235. It's because they're not even making a threat. They're making like the most latent of threat, a bargaining chip to negotiate away. They're trying to put pressure on the United States to come back to the table. That's not the same as racing to the bomb. That's why Marco Rubio says, never mind the intelligence, because the intelligence says what I just said.